Let's look at politics of the late 1800s. First off, politics in this time period was a major focus for the general public. Political events were preceded by rallies, there were sometimes parades, picnics were scheduled around political events, and political speeches were a common occurrence in America at this time. There were also party newspapers that people read regularly. There were newspapers that Republicans read, and there were newspapers that Democrats read. Much like today, there are news channels that Democrats prefer to watch and news channels that Republicans prefer to watch. Most telling is that from 1876 to 1896, we have 79% voter turnout in presidential elections. This is the highest 20-year average in U.S. history. However, let's not jump to conclusions about the level of democracy taking place in America at this time. Remember, for the most part, this is mostly men only. Women could only vote in federal elections in a few Western states. And in 1875, the National Women's Suffrage Association went to the Supreme Court with a case, Minor versus Happersett, where the Supreme Court told the National Women's Suffrage Association, no, states are allowed to deny women the right to vote. Also, a lot of this voting does not include African Americans, especially in the South. Remember, in 1877, Georgia passes a poll tax. Almost all other southern states follow suit soon thereafter. And in 1890, Mississippi is the first state to use a literacy test to prevent African Americans from voting. In fact, literacy tests were upheld as constitutional in Williams versus Mississippi. And the effect of literacy tests is dramatic on African American voting. For example, in Louisiana, after they passed a literacy test, African American voting dropped to 1/100th of what it was before those were allowed. And remember, just in case we're unclear, many states passed grandfather clauses which allowed illiterate whites and poor whites to continue to vote in these southern states, making it blatantly racist in what they were doing. During the 1870s and 1880s, politics were also dominated by Civil War veterans. By 1890, there are still 1 million living Union soldiers and approximately 300,000 former Confederate soldiers. 5 out of the 6 presidents elected from 1865 to 1900 served in the military in some fashion. And it's not just in politics where veterans are dominating, where veterans are in positions of leadership. There are veterans in positions of leadership in business and in religion as well. Veterans are taking up leadership positions in government. Veterans are voting for veterans as well. Let's look at the parties. Although the Democrats are virtually non-existent in Union politics during the Civil War and the time period after, they quickly are revived. In fact, they win the House of Representatives in 1874 and dominate the House for the next 20 years. Why? Well, the Democratic Party, much more so than the Republican Party, is the party of limited government at this time period. And that's the kind of thing that can get support everywhere in America. No matter where you go, you're going to be able to find people who like the idea of lower taxes. No matter where you go, you're going to like the idea of a less intrusive federal government, a government that is less involved in people's lives. Now, the Republican Party is still strongly associated with civil rights, and that means the federal government enforcing civil rights. The Republican Party is still strongly associated with military rule in the South. And as a result, there's going to be little to no votes for the Republican Party in the South, especially after African American votes are suppressed. Let's take a look at the Republican platform from this time period. The Republican Party is about promoting moral progress and economic growth. An increase in material wealth, if you will. And they accomplish this through various acts that start all the way back during the Civil War. We have the Homestead Act, which we talked about, which grants land to settlers out west. We have land grants being given to railroad companies and other businesses. And we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Reconstruction Amendments. And let's not forget, not listed here, but also a high protective tariff to help infant American industries. How were elections decided? Well, in the 1870s and 1880s, we have some trends, much like today. I apologize for this map being a little bit backwards, but there are 16 states in the 1870s and 1880s that pretty much in New England and in the North that voted Republican. They consistently voted Republican. They dependably voted Republican. And then there are about 14 states in the South that voted Democrat. Almost every time they voted Democrat. Elections were determined by what today we would call swing states. At that time, they called doubtful states. Those included New York and Ohio and the other states blacked in on this map. And much like today, candidates focused a lot of their time and energy in those doubtful or swing states. Let's shift our focus now to state governments. After the Civil War and after Reconstruction, many people are tired of having a strong central government telling them what to do. So, when problems arise, people first turn to state and local government, and many of the problems of this era dealt with industrialization. So, states create bureaus and commissions to oversee business, and mostly they're overseeing the railroad industry. Farmers and merchants at this time wanted to see an end to what they called rate discrimination, where railroad companies offered special prices to their big customers and charged high rates to small businesses and small farmers. In 1869, Massachusetts is the first state to establish one of these bureaus, but by 1900, 28 other states have followed suit. Most of these bureaus and commissions were advisory, meaning all they could do was collect data and publish their findings, try to draw attention to the problems, and hope that the legislators, the lawmakers, would do something about it. However, in the Midwest and on the Pacific Coast, those states gave a lot more power to their railroad commissions. Some of them allowed their railroad commissions to set prices, to outlaw rebates, and to even investigate railroad companies. In other words, get a court order for the railroad companies to turn over their economic records, turn over their books. This is the model that's going to be used for federal policy regulating all other businesses in the time after. A good example of this increased strength in the Midwest is the case of Munn versus Illinois. The state of Illinois had their legislature declare that railroads were public, not private, public highways, and that they, therefore, can be regulated by the government to benefit the public. So, the state of Illinois established maximum rates. Railroad companies operating in Illinois were not allowed to charge above a certain amount. And also, they banned rate discrimination. And these practices, this regulation by the state of Illinois, was upheld as constitutional in the Supreme Court case Munn versus Illinois in 1877. 9 years later, we get another case, Wabash versus Illinois. And now the court has to clarify. It has to make some modifications. It says that, in this case, that states can only regulate railroads that stay entirely in their borders. Reason being, because if they go outside their borders, then it becomes interstate commerce, which Congress, and only Congress, is allowed to regulate. So this puts the attention back on the federal government. If anybody's going to do anything about this, these railroad problems, it needs to be the federal government because most railroads run through more than one state. And Congress does. They passed the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887, and it outlaws rebates. It bans railroad trusts. It bans sudden rate changes and unpublished rates. And it also creates a new small part of the federal government, the Interstate Commerce Commission, to oversee all of these things. And this is the model that's going to be used for many federal commissions that regulate part of the economy. This is going to set a precedent for how the federal government can regulate parts of the economy. Let's look next at the presidency. And by 1877, the presidency is dramatically weakened. Johnson is impeached and almost removed from office. Grant's presidency is plagued by scandal, and then Rutherford B. Hayes takes office under the compromise, and I'm using air quotes for that, the compromise of 1877, which looks like a backroom deal to some people. To show you how weak the presidency was, Hayes tries to veto the Bland-Allison-Silver Purchase Act, which would have allowed the federal government to use silver and gold to back federal notes. His veto was overruled. That's a sure sign that a president is weak. Hayes is followed by James Garfield, who is assassinated by somebody who was upset that they were not given a federal government office. They were not given a federal government job that they thought they were owed because of their support for the presidential campaign. So Garfield is assassinated by a disgruntled office seeker and followed by his vice president, Chester A. Arthur, who helps Congress pass the Pendleton Act, which most importantly creates the Civil Service Commission, which is designed to administer exams and hire the most qualified government workers. Government jobs are no longer going to be seen as a reward for supporting the president in his campaign. These are going to go to qualified individuals. Now, the Civil Service Commission only has jurisdiction over a small number of government jobs when it is created, but almost all government jobs that are created after 1881 are going to fall under the Civil Service Commission's jurisdiction, and therefore the number of jobs that require an examination and require a resume and an interview process to be filled is going to grow with the government, and it brings a lot more legitimacy to the federal government. Arthur is also going to begin construction on a modern navy and dramatically lower the tariff. Grover Cleveland is the only Democrat elected in this time period, so he's the guy advocating for small federal government. And as a result, he vetoes over 2/3 of the bills submitted to him. He vetoes more than any president before him. He vetoes 414 bills. He also paid veterans pensions and he oversaw government appointments. He continues naval construction and he makes big companies like railroad and cattle and lumber companies give back land that they got as a result of fraudulent, maybe illegal deals out west. Cleveland continues to push for a lower tariff and loses the election of 1888 in the electoral count. However, Republicans win because Benjamin Harrison campaigned on a promise of defending American jobs.